Hello and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I'm George. Today we're going to break into the new Maugan Ra. It's a brand new sculpt after I don't know how many years. It looks fantastic. Let's break into it and see what we've got. And here is Maugan Ra. He looks awesome. This was a pretty neat build, and I mean, it was a little finicky, but Games Workshop designed this in such a way that it's relatively easy to get the finicky parts exactly where they need to go. When I mean finicky parts, I mean the arms. Whenever the arms are linked to the gun in a certain way, then we have problems. But they did a really good job of making sure the connection points were reasonable and they're robust, so you couldn't mess it up. And so as a result, turns out it was dummy proof, because this dummy built it, got it right, and it was relatively easy. So you'll see that this guy has a zenithal prime. I went with a black, and then I have a white zenithal on top because I do want to take advantage. I want to do a little bit better job than I typically do. I say that, and then halfway through the painting job, I'm just going to go, whatever. But seriously, I'm going to try. I'm going to really try on this one. So as you're building it, there's a couple of other things aside from the arms that I want to point out to you. So this cloak is it kind of wraps around his legs, which might present a painting problem. So as a result, I've primed him off of his model and off of his base, and I'm going to paint them separately, and then once they're all done, I'm going to put them together. And in order to accomplish this, I've added some sticky tack in the places where this model will connect here. The goal is to have pure paint to paint plastic to plastic contact, no paint in the middle, to ensure a very nice bond. The other thing is that because of the cloak wrapping around here, so it's in a couple of different pieces, and so you'll have this piece right here. It's continuation of the cape, and you glue it on, and no matter how nice of a job you do, you're going to have a seam where the two meet. I went ahead and filled in that seam with some liquid green stuff. I'm not really good with liquid green stuff, but I think I did an okay job. It's hard to see, but if you don't take the time to do this, it's going to be there, and it's going to look kind of ugly. It's an extra step you may or may not want to do. If you have the patience, if you have the skill, I would recommend trying it. I don't have the skill or the patience, but I found the patience, and I needed to practice on liquid green stuff because those seams are going to be, I think, a recurring issue. Another, like an Aeldari, a Tau character had a similar thing, and I left the gap open, and it's fine, but it looks gross. You can kind of tell it's there. So I need to practice on getting better at that. So I filled it in. It looks okay. Then I primed over it, and it should be okay. The other thing you have to consider is, do you glue the model and then paint it and then put it together, or do you paint it in sub-assemblies? I chose to glue everything together because it provides a better seal, a better joint for the model. I don't want pieces falling apart, which will happen if you use super glue, especially if there's paint involved, which means it's going to be kind of a tighter fit, but there's not a lot underneath here. And since it's all in shadow and the model is going to be fairly dark, I think it's going to be fine. As long as I don't glue the base on here, I can get to everything I need to get to right inside there. It should be okay. So yeah, I think it'll be all right. So these are just some things to keep in mind as you are building and then eventually assembling your model. I do want to point out that I dressed up the base just a little bit. I've added a couple of extra skulls from my Box O Skulls from Games Workshop kit. Since this is going to be a skulls heavy model, I figured, let's throw in some more skulls in there. And then I added some texture, some grit, and it looks pretty decent. Yeah, it should paint up pretty nicely, and it'll fit the theme of the overall model. But I did want to point this out because I'm really bad about painting the base after the model is done. In other words, I wait till everything is done before I pay any attention to the base, and then I'll put down a priming layer, and then I'll start putting on some paint, and then I realize I've forgotten the grit. And for best results, you want to get all the grit, all the texture that you put on, you want to put it on before you prime. That way it's all one step. You don't have to go back and do things over and over again. So that's something I remember to do this time, and I'm going to try to keep that happening moving forward. I should also point out that in building this model, I realized that there are 0 options. There's no customization that you can do to this model, at least not out of the box. Sure, you can repose if you're willing to do some sculpting and some cutting and what have you, but just a fresh build, just a normal build right out of the box. There are no alternate heads, there are no alternate weapons, no alternate arms, not even that much decoration that isn't already molded into the actual model. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, as this model is a really good looking model, but for those of you who like to customize your models or maybe add some variations, it's going to take a little bit of work. I should also note that you use every single part on the plastic sprue. There's nothing left over. No bits, no pieces. So there's that. So, the plan for Maugan Ra is going to be black, obviously, right? I'm going to go with a black cloak to kind of emphasize the Reaper's kind of aesthetic that this guy has going on. But I do want to emphasize kind of the skeletal nature. So, I'm going to go with some bone white. It's a bone-colored white, and his armor is going to be that color. I'm not going to go black armor and black cloak. I'm going to go bone white armor, black cloak. So it looks like he's a skeleton underneath the cloak. Obviously it's armor, but I want to kind of enhance that skeleton vibe, if that makes any sense. And the inside of the cloak presents an interesting issue. Do I keep it black or do I have another color in there? And I think I want to introduce a different color. I want to do a purple, like a rich dark purple, and make it nice and dark. So it lines the inside of the cloak just to kind of emphasize that's the inside. As for the accoutrement, like the gun and stuff like that, I haven't decided yet, but I'm going to let the model kind of take me where it will. So now that we have the plan for more or less along the way, just a reminder, I'm going to do a quick paint with this, which involves glazes, and I'm going to go with thinner glazes this time around, which means I'm going to have to do multiple coats, but I want to let the zenithal priming really shine here, and if I use a thinner glaze, that's going to give more opportunity for that to happen, particularly for the bone white. So that is the plan. The first element that I'm going to base coat is going to be the skeletal parts, so the torso, the legs, that totem that he's got on his back, his arms, those sort of things. And I'm using skeleton bone from Army Painter, and it's thinned down with quite a bit of this stuff. It's a flow improver and a bit of water so that I have a nice thin glaze. Unfortunately, in this case, it wasn't as thin as I was expecting, so the bone white is fairly thick or fairly opaque yet, which is a bit of a problem, but it's fine. It's fine. For the inside of the Reaper's cloak, I went with a purple. Now, I've had some problems with Army Painter's purple. I usually go with something like that, Orc Blood, or something like this, Alien Purple. And for some reason, they're just super, super transparent, and I just can't get them to do much of anything, even when they're close to full strength. So I decided on something different. I decided to go with a little bit of this. This is Citadel Colors Layer Xeris Purple. I'm not very familiar with the color, but I wanted to give it a shot as an alternative to purples that I know don't work for me. So I thinned this down to a thin glaze consistency, and then I added a little bit of matte black. This is to help it darken up a bit so that it looks like it's in shadow. I'm going to apply this to all the kind of the inside parts of the Reaper's cloak. For Maugan Ra's cloak, I went with Army Painter's Necromancer cloak. This is the darkest gray that I have at my disposal, and in the past it's done a really good job of approximating black, particularly after a good washing with dark tone. And that's what I'm going to go with here. I want subsequent steps to help me bring out the shadows, highlights, and some midtones without a bunch of muss and fuss. I'm going to apply this very thin glaze over all of the outside of Maugan Ra's cloak, and that includes his hood. For Maugan Ra's weapon, I went with two colors. The first one of these is a bit of an odd choice, I know, but I went with Army Painter's Glistening Blood. It's an effects war paint. I'm not sure exactly what about it is effects. I'm guessing it's a glossy finish, but I'm not entirely sure. And I haven't used it because I was afraid of what it was going to look like with the effects. I didn't do a lot of blood splatter on my models, but I really liked the red. And I thought, man, I wonder if I could use it. And sure enough, I mixed my normal glaze stuff, and then I added a bit of matte black, mixed it all together, and I got a really nice shade of dark red. It's almost like a violet. It's a really nice complement to the color, and I think this will be a nice accent for just a little detail here and there on Maugan Ra's model, and I think it ties in well with the purple of the inside of his cloak. For the blade of the Mugatar, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but that's what I'm going to go with. I went with a bone white, and the idea here is that I'm going to add another layer of color on the blade part, maybe like a darker brown, to kind of emphasize or allude to the fact that this is a wraithbone weapon. I don't know if it really is, and most of the reference artwork that I've seen has it looking like a metal blade, but I want something wraithbone, and it'll tie the weapon together with the rest of Maugan Ra. I think it's a good choice. Before I move on to the next couple of steps in this painting project, I have to reattach Maugan Ra's. These look like magazines for the Mugatar, and it was attached to the model with a very small connection point, and I was worried it was going to fall off, and as I was handling it for painting, sure enough, it fell off. Rather than mess with glue, whether it's plastic or super, I'm going to go ahead and use a little bit of this green stuff. It's yeah, I use Army Painter's version of green stuff. There's a lot of different companies, but this one is the one that seems to work the best for me. So I'm just going to use it to more or less permanently attach the weapon deal to the model. Once it dries, I'll scrape off the excess. Yeah, it's something I have to do sometimes with models with really finicky connection points. But that's okay. It looks really cool, and I hope that I'm going to make it blend into the rest of the model. The basing is done, and Maugan Ra is looking pretty neato. You can see the bone, you can see the gray, and you can see that really cool looking red. I'm digging it. It was a nice accident. Not so much an accident. It was a nice discovery, and I'm going to use that in a bunch of other models now that I know how it works and what it looks like. The next step is the washing step. This is where the bone and the gray become basically their final colors. So for the bone, I'm going to use Citadel Colors Agrax Earthshade. And for the dark gray, I'm not going to use Nuln Oil because I think it's a little too light. I'm going to use something from Army. I'm going to use a dark tone from Army Painter. And I'm going to thin it down just a little bit so it isn't too gloopy. That's something that I've noticed in the past. So let's get started with that. For Maugan Ra's bone armor, I wanted to accentuate the idea that it's, skeletal. And for the wash, I went with Citadel Colors Agrax Earthshade. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a product that's relatively new to me. I've only used it once before, but I really like the way it looks. It's akin to one of the... It's kind of similar to one of these guys, Army Painter's mid-brown and strong tone. But it has a kind of a unique... Well, not unique. It's a different kind of texture or the flow. It's like a thinner product, and it doesn't do as much pooling. It's a little bit more controllable. It just looks really nice over bone armor or the skeleton bone color. So I'm going to use it here, just adding it to everything that has that bone armor color, making sure I control where it pulls and so I don't get any ugly blotches. It's pretty straightforward, but it looks pretty good. The wash for the cloak is going to be a little bit of this stuff. It's Army Painter's dark tone, but I've had some issues with this in the past where it kind of pulled too much and it was a little sticky, so I've thinned it down with just a bit of water, and layering this over all of the dark gray that was Maugan Ra's cloak and his hood. That should darken up the gray, make it look black, and also it should pull up on all those little crevices and make them look darker, give us some of those shadows, and establish those midtones, and help us establish also those highlights without having to do that manually. Here he is, Mr. Ra. I'm going to call him Mr. Ra. I've put him on his base because I'm basically done with the inside of the robe elements. It sounds a little dirty, I didn't mean it that way. But he's got his base coat glazes, he's got the washes, and I've got to say, so far he looks really good. I think it's the best model I've done so far, at least at this stage, right? There's still plenty of time for me to mess things up in the detailing phase, which is coming up next. I just want to take a pause and just admire what I've accomplished so far, and it's relatively easy. So before I move on, I just want to point out that as I mounted him on his base, I realized I had made a mistake. There's one way to put him on his base, what with the Aeldari webway thing kind of in the way there. So I had to do some moving around, and as I did that, I kind of messed things up. So if you add the glue and then you move stuff around and then maybe there's paint in certain places, it starts getting kind of gross. So if you see little green stuff on there, well, that's how I ended up having to put him on his base. I ended up having to use green stuff to have a secure hold. And so I'm going to, as I touch up the model, I'm going to get rid of that green stuff, at least the excess, and then I'll paint it over to kind of mask it, disguise it, make it part of the base. I'm really happy with how he's turned out so far, so I think I think before I move on to to the detailing phase, I'm going to do just a little bit of dry brushing. And I'm not going to dry brush everything. I'm only going to dry brush the bone armor stuff. So his totem, his armor, anything that's got that bone, I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to dry brush it as a highlight. And so I'm going to go with a couple of phases to make the highlights progressively brighter. And I think that's all the dry brushing I'm going to need to do, at least at this phase. Now, I could have gone with the detailing first and then the dry brushing, but because the dry brushing is like it's a macro level, or it's a gross level. In other words, it covers a large part of it. I'm going to require kind of long strokes of the brush to get the highlight that I want, and it could damage any detailing that I do. So I want to make sure to get that done now. I could do the same with the cloak, but honestly, I'm happy with the way it looks. It's black, and it's got shadows, and it's got highlights. I think that if I do anything else to it, it's going to look worse than it is. And that's always a factor, at least in my mind, as the project progresses, is each successive layer should enhance the model rather than detract from it. And at my skill level, I've gotten pretty decent at, adding the base coat and adding the washes, the detail. Well, that's where I fall flat sometimes. So I'm going to be extra careful. I'm going to be very sparing with what details I add on here. So let's get to work. Let's do some of that dry brushing. The first pass of dry brush I'm going to add to the skeleton bone elements of Maugan Ra's armor are going to be obviously with skeleton bone. This is the color that was originally on the model, and that was before I added the dark wash. So that restores some of the original color to kind of help me establish some of the midtones, or reestablish some of the midtones, and help add a layer of something before the next highlight layer. Now for the face, I'm doing something a little different. All I'm doing is I'm just adding a bit of dry brush of the skeleton bone. Rather than go in there and do anything else fancy, I'm just gonna lightly touch a very small brush inside his hood, and that's gonna enhance the idea, that skeletal aspect of his helmet. And it keeps everything else that isn't that highlight in deep dark shadow, giving him this very menacing look. I really like the way that looks. And honestly, given how tight the mask or the face is, it's probably the only way to get that job done. So it works out. The detailing phase is a bit tricky to describe on camera, or to capture on camera. The angles are kind of tight. Anyway, I'll do my best to show you kind of the things that I'm doing, but generally speaking, I'll talk instead about the strategy that's involved. At my skill level, right, I'm not particularly good. I'm getting better, but I'm not really good. So it's important for me to understand my limitations. And if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you're not at the, top of your performance. You're getting better, but you haven't got all your skills locked in. So it's important to kind of pick and choose. There's lots of little details that you could paint, with different colors and different textures, different techniques. If your skills aren't what they could be, I think it's important to pick and choose, right? So pick those details that A, you're pretty sure you can handle for the most part, and B, that aren't going to detract from the eye, right? So the details are there to enhance the model that you already have, but every new detail that you add runs the risk of looking worse than what was already there. So for Maugan Ra, I picked up just a few details on the weapon magazines. I added some metallic silver, and I'm keeping it really bright. I want the silver to just kind of stand out and pop. I've also picked out any jewels, any pendants. Aeldari have quite a few of these things, so I put them all in silver settings. Generally speaking, I think it's recommended, and I agree with this recommendation, to pick, if you're going to use a metallic color, pick one, right? Silver or gold, and maybe a few variations on the same metallic color. But putting silver and gold on a single model can be a little tricky. Throw in bronze and then you're getting all kinds of busy. So if you use gold, cool. Stick with gold for all your metallic accents. Maybe wash some, maybe highlight some, etc., but keep it gold. Same thing is with silver. I'm going with silver. I think it looks really nice with black and bone, and so I've done that. There's also a really impressive symbol on Maugan Ra's weapon, and so I've chosen to pick that out. Now, anytime I'm using a silver metallic, I've undercoated it in black first. If you undercoat in black, the silver metallic will pop. It'll look way better than it would without it. Once that silver layer is on there, on any jewels, I'll undercoat those in white, slap on a different color for the jewel, and that's basically it. Probably the last thing I want to mention on this detailing phase, a lot of these details are really small and they're really thin. So I'm thinking, for example, of the kind of the filigree, the symbol on Maugan Ra's weapon. It's a very small, it's actually a fairly large symbol, but it's raised from the weapon and the lines are very, very thin. The jewels are really, really small, and even the magazines for the weapon, they have quite a bit of that little filigree on that. And to do that well, I would recommend not using your normal painting techniques. What I would recommend is to use what I call overbrushing. You could look up that technique elsewhere. It's essentially like dry brushing, but you're not going to dry your brush all the way. In fact, you're keeping it fairly loaded, but not full, right? Because you want the paint to stick just to those filigree things, the things that you're touching with a brush, and you're going to do a very light touch. You're basically just going to lightly brush that raised surface so that your brush doesn't make any contact with the parts underneath. It's called overbrushing. It's a very handy technique, particularly for details like these. Boom, Maugan Ra. Pretty neat. I really enjoyed this project. It's one of the paint jobs I'm more satisfied, or I haven't been as satisfied with a recent painting job in a while. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but let's just focus on the model. It was a really nice build for the most part. It was a fun paint. It was relatively easy, and it was quick. Maybe it's because it was just one dude. But I love the way he looks. I've learned a couple of things in this painting process. I've learned that my glazes, thin as I thought they were too thick, particularly for zenithal priming. I am really happy with the look of the cloak, and that is almost 100% as a result of the zenithal prime plus my thinner glazes. But it's important to note that this progress that I've made in the past couple of projects has been, I want to attribute it mostly to my experimentation. I published a couple of videos on speed paints, and there was a couple of things I did wrong. There was a couple of things I didn't do wrong, but people on my comments maybe thought I did wrong. But the whole point was that it forced me to experiment. It forced me to try things that I hadn't tried before. I was so focused on just painting, get the project done so you can get the footage and then, edit, that I wasn't learning. I was just doing what I already knew. And experimenting with paints and the mixes and the primers and all that kind of stuff, it culminated in this. A lot of the stuff that I learned in that process I applied here, and I think as a result I have a nice looking model. I mean, the cape, the cloak, is the nicest looking cloak I think I've ever done. And there's a lot of there's a bit of shadow, there's a bit of highlight, but it's subtle, and it's the subtlety that I think makes it work, at least for me. Now, that isn't to say that I didn't make some concessions, and they're concessions that are mostly as a result of my skill level. And these are things that I would suggest that if you have kind of a low to moderate skill level, but you still want to have good-looking models in your collection, choose simplicity. It's really easy to go in there and try to paint all the little bubbles on the gun. It's really easy to go in there and try to do a super job and all this stuff. But if you have low to moderate skill level, you're going to be limited. Until you practice, until you get better and implement the new lessons, it's going to be easier to just go simple. I mean, when you think about the detailing, right? It's so easy to get stuff wrong, and when you get stuff wrong, it just makes your model look like trash, even if the fundamental steps are there. When I think about adding more colors and painting more details, you kind of have to keep in mind that I don't have a background in art, right? So there's some people that are geniuses who are well trained and very experienced with color selection and how to make different colors work. I don't have that, and so I'm very conservative in the number of colors that I choose, and I don't know. So I think these are important considerations for you as you're building and painting your own models. Understand your limitations and get the fundamentals right. A good base coat and a good shade can take you 90% of the way. If those two things look good, your model is going to look good. Just, you have to be careful with the subsequent steps not to mess it up. So, base coat glazes, washes, and dry brushes, these are all your friend. You can get really nice results really quickly, and you don't have to be a pro to get them done. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe enjoyed the slightly new format. I'm trying to make the videos a bit more brief and possibly a little bit more engaging. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, consider giving me a like or a subscribe. Tell a friend, whatever. I would love to continue making content, and you can help with that. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.